reflect in the second day, to begin our day with to reflect on the idea of heritage in relation to the uncertainties of our current times, due to the political extremism that we are facing in many parts of the world, the climate emergency, as well as the COVID pandemic. And to lead this discussion, I have the pleasure and honor to invite Professor Laurajane Smith, our keynote speaker of the day, who has re-theorized the idea of heritage, challenging traditional Western definitions of heritage that focus on material and monumental forms of old or aesthetically pleasing tangible heritage. Dr. Laurajane Smith is a professor and director of the Center of Heritage and Museum Studies, the Research School of Humanities and the Arts at the Australian National University. She's a fellow of the Society for the Academy for the Social Sciences in Australia and has founded the Association of Critical Heritage Studies. Professor Smith has been the editor of the International Journal of Heritage Studies since 2009. She's the co-general editor of the Routledge Key Issues in Cultural Heritage and author of Uses of Heritage and Emotional Heritage. She's also the editor of Notsaku Akagawa of Intangible Heritage and in Safeguarding Intangible Heritage, which is a publication that came out in 2018. With that, without further ado, I would like to now invite Dr. Laurajane Smith to begin her presentation. Over to Professor Laurajane Smith.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Okay, so my screen is frozen. I don't know if anyone can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you, Laurajane. I think there's, yeah.
Okay, good. All right. Well, thank you very much for both the introduction and the invitation to speak here today. I'm just going to fiddle with screen sharing. Bear with me for a moment. Okay, so is that all right? We can see that?
Yes, we can. You start sharing your screen. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I need to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose land both the ANU and myself, the ANU being my university, and myself resides. And I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Okay, so accelerating climate change, the COVID pandemic, and increasing right-wing populism, particularly the rise of right-wing radicalism that threatens to derail acts of peacemaking, reconciliation, climate action, and equity in responses to the pandemic, have individually and collectively presented us with an increasingly exhausting set of circumstances and experiences. What is the relevance of heritage to these complex and interconnected occurrences? Why engage with the past when the present and its implications for the future so urgently call for our attention? What may the aesthetics of places that the present has inherited, enrolled on registers and lists, advertised as tourist attractions and included in history curricula have to do with contemporary social and political tensions and emerging complex interconnected occurrences? Why engage with the past when the present sorry, I'm getting some significant feedback here, so my apologies if things are unclear. I want to suggest that heritage plays a role in navigating and understanding contemporary political and environmental and social issues. It can also help us understand the rise of populism while challenging it and presenting us with the possibilities of imagining and thus working toward more equitable and sustainable futures. Central to understanding this role is how heritage is defined and, of course, by whom. So today I want to revisit the challenges I have made in the past to definitions that overly emphasise the materiality of heritage and treat it as being simply about the past. I want to stress that heritage is ultimately about people and how people utilise the past as either heritage, history, or memory to navigate political and social problems they experience in the present. Heritage is a performance and an emotive process, a set of actions, emotions, and practices of making meaning in and for the present. It is a process of affirming or challenging the social and political values that sustain our sense of place and social and cultural identity and prefigure our future aspirations. It is performative in that cultural, social, and political meanings are made, remade, and affirmed in these practices. So ultimately, heritage is a practice that is fundamentally about negotiating the nature of social and cultural change and mediating social and cultural conflicts. Professional practices and non-expert practices, such as those of communities and other subnational groups, all play a part in this process. Heritage sites, places, buildings, museum collections, alongside intangible heritage and so on, are all part of the cultural toolkit used to help people undertake the remembering and commemorative practices we use to navigate change and unrest. However, the social and political consequences of heritage practices are often obscured by the discourses that frame professional practice, as much as they are obscured by definitions that overemphasise materiality. The dominant discourse, what I've called the authorised heritage discourse, has historically underpinned both UNESCO and ICOMOS conventions and charters, and is in turn given authority by them. There are, of course, many different and competing discourses that frame heritage practices, but these are all too often obscured or marginalised by the authorised discourse. And certainly within the authorised discourse, heritage tends to be understood primarily as material objects and places with inherent and immutable value and meaning. It places heritage in the past and emphasises the great and the good, while defining heritage as fragile, finite, and non-renewable. Heritage is placed under the stewardship of so-called objective experts who must communicate the authentic value of heritage to the nation and humanity at large. Heritage must be passed on and preserved unchanged. Conserved as found, lest values become compromised. Now, in this discourse and associated practice, any meaning or meanings a heritage site may have in the present is judged to be less critical than past values. This discourse misunderstands that heritage things do not have inherent values. Things are continually and actively valued, and they're revalued and valued differently or not valued at all by different groups of people. And of course, values can and do change over time. The authorised discourse not only marginalises non-expert values and meanings, but also obscures the importance of people. Heritage is only heritage when it is valued and used by people to do things, such as affirm or challenge identity and sense of place, challenge or affirm, receive historical narratives of nationhood and citizenship, or affirm and challenge the values that define those narratives. The process of valuing heritage is how the present works through the values and meaning the past has for the present and what we hope it will do for the future. And we can see this at play in the rise of populism with its utilisation of reactionary forms of nostalgia, an example being Britain's rejection of a broader European identity by appealing to past imperial values. Ideas of British heritage and history were reworked to alleviate and justify fear of change. Conversely, heritage can be used to work through and legitimise progressive political values through more politically progressive forms of nostalgia. And a case in point is work that Veronica Mack has done, research work that she has done on milk tea. She documents how a form of intangible heritage has become a potent populist symbol of solidarity and resistance in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Thailand, and how it continues to bring people together to affirm the legitimacy of social and political change. Now, a survey I did in England and the United States and Australia asked people what the term heritage meant to them. Only 19% gave me definitions that were framed within the authorised discourse, that is, replicated expert definitions of material sites and places. Overwhelmingly, people talked instead about heritage was a feeling that linked to their sense of place, identity, and well-being in the present. And there are some examples of people's responses on the screen. Nonetheless, recent theoretical interventions into heritage that claim to be responding to climate change have re-emphasised the materiality of heritage and give the non or more than human agency in heritage debates and practices. This so-called new materialist response has questioned what it calls presentism and the overemphasis of humanism in critical heritage debates. As I've argued elsewhere, I see this as a palliative theory that obfuscates the responsibilities of people for environmental change and gets us nowhere particularly useful. We need to embrace how heritage is used in the present to understand its consequences for the future. We need to engage with how it is used by people in the present to understand their contemporary lived experiences. In conclusion, I'm arguing that heritage is about people. For heritage to help us address peace, reconciliation, and climate change, we need to engage with research and professional practices that ask, in what contexts and why do people utilise heritage objects and places? How and why are values and meaning given to material and intangible heritage? What does this process do? What are its social and political consequences? In understanding and engaging with heritage as a performative and effective practice, interventions can be made into these processes to embrace and engage constructively with changing circumstances. In challenging the authorised heritage discourse and other overly object-orientated definitions of heritage, we open up space to both recognise and equitably engage with the diversity of ways heritage works to help communities and nations rethink, legitimise or challenge aspirations for the future. So for heritage to be relevant to the issues that confront us in the here and now requires a commitment to a people-centric understanding of heritage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Laurajane. This was a very interesting and illuminating lecture, a talk. I wish you could go on forever, and but this online mode is forcing us to keep it very short. But I already have a question in the chat, and I would rather at this point to invite the speaker to, unmute themselves, the person who has put this in the chat, to ask the question themselves. But I can, if they are not able to do so, I can ask the question. And the question is, taking into consideration that heritage is a process, acts of vandalism on colonial statues, for example, could be seen as non-official heritage practices? What do you think?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
It's part of the processes of us working through what's important and not important for both the present and the future. It's the decisions to question the legitimacy of certain statues and to tear them down is absolutely part of the heritage process. It's part of the process of remaking the past, of re-emphasising different values that we want to bring or that we want to reassert in the present and bring to the future. Absolutely.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? Do we see other questions from people around us? Are there any other questions for Professor Laurajane? Kelly, perhaps you have a question?
Yes, I also see there's a question from David, but I can ask my question first and then I'll invite David to ask. So my question is, yesterday there was an interesting discussion about different types of communities and how perhaps we need to expand our definition of communities to also include non-human entities. So I was wondering how this would interact with the definition of heritage you were talking about. If it's always about people, how do we bring non-human entities into that?
Well, material, what you're calling non-human entities, material objects, sites, and places. They're part of the cultural toolkit, as I said, that we use to help us work through the meaning of the past for the present, and so on. So I guess I have problems with assigning non-human objects with objects agency. Why are we doing so? As I said, I think it's a palliative response. It's a let's theorize. Let's play with theory and not really engage with who actually is responsible here and who are suffering the consequences. It's people. We can't anthropomorphize objects. That it gets us nowhere. So yeah, we need to take the responsibility that we're having on the planet, and assigning objects agency, and worrying about the rights of objects and so on. I can't see the point. I mean, I am not suggesting that we don't have responsibilities to protect animals and the environment and plants and so on. Absolutely we do, and we have to take that responsibility. But we also, in doing so, I would also add, we need to engage with how different communities use objects and places and sites. And for some communities, those objects and places are perceived to be inherently valuable. They do have those forms of agency, but we are still working with how people are valuing those places. We are still working with the people whose utilisation of those sites and places has a consequence, as I said, for themselves, has a political and cultural social consequence for themselves.
Well, this is really interesting, and I also have a question, but I see a hand going up. That's Dr. Susan McIntyre, I think. Yes, please, if you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Yes.
Yes, I think the previous question was a bit misunderstood, perhaps, that the idea of giving agency to other entities is not about necessarily giving the agencies to objects, although that is a possibility, but giving the agencies to other living organisms. And we've seen examples of this with, rivers being given agency in some under legislation in some countries. And I think if we're talking about the unofficial heritage discourse, it seems to me that there's a slight point missed, because if you look at, say, in Australia, Aboriginal heritage, Aboriginal communities, they certainly do believe that other things other than humans have agency in this process, and that things other than human actually have a causal relationship, an impact on their lives and on events, and that human and nature, if you like, interactions, or human and spiritual interactions actually have consequences that need to be managed. And it's not about objects per se.
Thank you, Susan. I'm not okay. So I am not discounting that the ways in which things are valued and the relationships that the different and quite complex relationships that various cultural and community groups, such as you mentioned, Indigenous Australian groups, have with places and landscapes and so on. I'm not discounting that, and I would argue that is highly important for us to take into consideration, as I said to the last speaker, how people value and engage with objects and places is absolutely important to understand. But we need to keep that responsibility that we have to people, to the environment, to to animals and so on, front and centre. We have that responsibility. We can't abrogate that by elevating, putting ourselves within the professional practices that we engage in, elevating the object above people. I think that is highly problematic, and it reinvents the authorised heritage discourse. I think we have to be, we have to listen. We have to be engaged with how people value the past and value the objects and so on that they regard as important in that process of heritage making. To re-theorise objects as standing outside of how we as professionals engage with heritage, I think has the potential to obfuscate the role of people in this process and the consequences of this process on people's lived experiences.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, progressing this a little, just advancing on the, and keeping this thought in mind. And there is a question from Joao. I do not know if Joao is joining us. He's from Brazil. Joao,
I'm here,
are you there?
Aparna.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So, would you like to ask your question on authorized heritage discourse for climate change? Because I think this is quite connected to what is being said right now or being discussed right now. Okay.
Okay. So, Professor Laurajane Smith, it's an honor to talk to you. And the question that I said, it's HAD came from a system of power structure that has also led us to the climate change. Is there an HAD for how we think about nature and climate change? What needs to be deconstructed and challenged?
What needs to be
deconstructed and challenged?
Deconstructed and challenged.
Well, I mean, I think we do. We have to unpack that discourse, and we need to challenge it. I mean, David asked the question: does UNESCO and organisations like UNESCO, can it be part of the solution? And absolutely, the answer is yes. We need to reconfigure our professional practices, the ways in which that we engage with and interact with communities of interest. Part of what I think is crucial is understanding what is at stake for people in this process. What is at stake for people, and understanding what is at stake helps us to dismantle the inequities of professional practice and of professional understandings and definitions of heritage. So, it requires us, to be more reflexive, but it actually requires us to embrace the political and accept that that we're political animals and that we need to engage in a process of understanding the consequences of what we does to people and engaging with that and taking apart those power relations so that we create a more equitable heritage process.
But is there a specific language, just as Professor Dr. Susan McIntyre said, that there are other human earth interactions or the indigenous communities that are speaking about climate change in a different language? Is there a specific authorized language that you see or that you have seen about climate change which needs to be deconstructed?
Well, I think yes, one that obfuscates the role that people have played in this process. Sorry, I'm beating off a cat here. I think one that attempts to climate. Sorry, I'm thinking through your question.
Yes.
I think that there is a tendency to see heritage as this pristine, pretty landscape that we must preserve unchanged and so on, and that we need ultimately to understand that actually heritage is a changing process. It is constantly under change, not only in terms of how we value, but things change. And I think one of the things that becomes really important is to really reflect on what are we afraid of? What is the processes of fear and uncertainty that tends to drive us to cling on to that sense of certainty that we assume heritage gives us, and to be more creative and more imaginative in the processes that we engage in with heritage, to allow us to think about new ways of being, to explore the possibilities of change. And that, to go back to Susan and I think Kelly's point, that requires us to engage with different discourses and understandings of heritage. It doesn't mean that we should appropriate those and take them for ourselves and assimilate those into dominant responses, but it requires us to think more critically, to engage more equitably with the different ways in which heritage is understood and used by individuals and collectives.
Yeah. I also read another. I'm reading another comment in the. I think it's a question and it's an in between a comment and a question. In a multicultural, it's Yapeng O. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask this question yourself? Or I can read it out. It's.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Tandon. I could also ask myself. So yes. Since I also lived in Europe and in North America, so I really think that what is happening there is really a process of the societies are becoming really multicultural, and you have a much more mobility and people from everywhere. So I just wonder, in such a multicultural society with a lot of different values and tribal integration process, and I don't think maybe it's always a harmonious coexistence between cultures. So will this trend of pluralistic and conflicting perceptions of heritage finally will lead to deconstruction of history and more social conflicts between diverse social cultural groups? So it seems that heritage is failing to perform its role as a medium for social integration. Thank you, Professor Smith.
That's a good question. Okay, so the more we open up dialogue, the more that we engage in engagement with different groups and so on, as you say, multicultural society, the more that opens up conflict. Absolutely. Of course it does, but that is not something that we should be afraid of, that we should fear. Again, I would argue that as heritage scholars and as heritage professionals, we need to understand the political consequences of what we do, the consequences that it has on different groups and communities and so on in society. It requires us to be political animals. It requires us to have a political agenda and to support some groups and to challenge others. When we, as I said, we see this arising in, the whole tensions between right-wing and populist utilizations of heritages and the challenges that groups like Black Lives Matter and Indigenous populations and the Me Too movement, amongst others, have mounted in defence and in opposition. So, when we engage, as I said, as heritage professionals and academics with different community groups, we have to have an understanding of the politics of that. We have to have an agenda. We can take sides. We can advance certain causes and challenge others. But we have to understand what are the power relations that we are engaging with. As I said, going back to my comment, we have to understand what is at stake, for whom, and to be aware of our own positions within those struggles, and to critically engage with issues of heritage and power, so that we recreate a more equitable situation. Now, that doesn't mean that in that process that we won't create more. We may create new problems, we may create new inequities, but that requires us to constantly be engaged with that political process of change and reflection and challenge. So yeah, we have to be political.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your answer. Thank you.
That's fine.
So I can see that there are so many comments popping up and questions, but there's one I think an interesting one where I think it is from Sophia Alexio, and she's saying that I understand the consequences of what we do. I completely agree. We architects in the architectural conservation of public buildings have a role in this. This importance of knowing the people's values. But how can we overcome this barrier? So, Sophia.
Which barrier, sorry?
Which barrier, Sophia, you're talking about?
I can explain. Good morning. Yes. Good morning, from Lisbon, Portugal, Dr. Laurajane. It's a pleasure to see you and to talk to you. The thing is, as a practitioner, we always struggle to have information from the owners of the buildings. I mean, the owners make a huge barrier and do not allow us to talk to the users of the buildings. I'm talking about public buildings, of course. So whenever we as conservators, as heritage conservators, have an assignment to do an intervention in a building, we are very interested in understanding how do people really value the building, the users of the buildings. I'm talking about schools, for example. And the owners, the public, the government never give us time to make inquiries, to understand how people use the buildings. The rush and the speed of the money speaks louder than the time we need to really understand how people value the building. So we sometimes we might be doing huge mistakes in the conservation intervention and we don't know about it. So how can we change the owners of the building's mind and to allow us to have time to understand the real values that the users give to the buildings? Thank you very much.
Well, I think that speaks to some of the problems that we have in the way we have trained as heritage professionals. I think we often don't or haven't prioritised the skills of interviewing and oral histories and the utility of simply talking and creating spaces for the owners or the users of heritage sites to really engage with us. I certainly, there's a tendency to emphasise the material sciences and the recording and so on of material things and places in the heritage management process. And I think we need to give more attention to those methodologies that help us talk to people. Having said that, though, I also appreciate that in the heritage management process in many countries, we are under pressure, to get things done in certain timeframes. There are, developmental pressures and so on. Those are the realities, of course, that we work with. But I think also, we need to prioritise those skills of talking and listening.
I think there is a related question from Jasna. Jasna, if you are with us, maybe you can ask it. You can unmute yourself and pose your question yourself. Otherwise, I can ask you know, and it's exactly what you were saying earlier, how to change the conservators' paradigm of keeping status quo instead of allowing change on the cultural and historic phenomena, and that we are trying to protect and preserve, or in other words, how to promote taking responsibility for allowing change. Would you like to, you know, just continue what you were saying and then, you know, extend the thought a little bit to?
Yeah, I mean, I think again it comes back to, you know, challenging that the professional discourses that we have, the authorised discourse. But then I would say that, but it's also
about responsibility. It's also about responsibility, professional responsibility. Like, how do you go against the, you know, the general perception and the setup and the.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy for me in you know, sitting in where I do to say, oh yeah, we must challenge the authorised discourse. What do we put in it? What do we put in its place? And you know, it is what we put in its place is a greater sense of, as I said, reflection about the political, about the responsibility that we have, the understanding that there are you know, heritage is valued differently across time and space and different groups and so on, and to be constantly asking, who are we doing this for? What are we doing, and who are we doing it for? Who benefits and who is disadvantaged? I think those are really key questions. They're obvious questions, and they're questions that, you know, people have been asking in various forms for a long time, but it is important that we continue to ask them. What are we doing? Who benefits? And who doesn't? What are the consequences? This is a, you know, a issue that I keep coming back to. What are the consequences of what we do? What does, you know, what impact does it have on people's everyday experiences? And as you say, taking responsibility for those consequences, and working with communities to ensure that you know, that equitable aspirations are achieved as much as we can. I mean, I'm not, you know, saying that, you know, all responsibility is down to us. We can save the world, but we can work towards that by being more conscious of the social and political consequences of our actions, and being brave to accept that we are political and that we have political agendas, and being honest about those agendas with the groups and with the groups and communities with which we work and our colleagues. What are our political agendas here?
Yes, and I think that sums it up very well, that we have to be aware of our own biases, our own agendas, and we have to understand that well and have an understanding, and try to understand that where are we coming from,
and be honestly communicative about that, to be, you know, to be aware and to engage in honest debate about that, to accept that we might be wrong in certain instances, or that our agendas are not appropriate in other contexts.
Yes, and I have David Harvey saying a constant attention to how power operates. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And looking at power structures. I have a very interesting comment from Susan. She's saying that I think there is slippage here. Susan, would you like to say it yourself? It's better that you say it than I read it out for you. Would you? Or she's not here with us?
No, that's okay. I can read her. I mean, she's saying, there's a slippage, you know, between heritage and how I'm talking about it, and how ICOMOS and UNESCO are actually now engaging with the practices of people and the crisis of grief they are facing. Absolutely. I have never said the authorised heritage discourse is immutable. Indeed, I want it to change, and I hope it will change. And of course, there will be new authorised or dominant discourses.
Dominant discourses.
And that's a good thing. We want it to change. And yes, going back to David's point, can, ICOMOS and UNESCO be part of the solution? Absolutely. It means, embracing the political and being very aware of the consequences of what we do, as much for those institutions as it is for the individuals that work within it. And she notes that for most people, heritage is multifaceted. It's about places and practices. Absolutely. Of course, heritage is multifaceted. That is what indeed I'm arguing. And yes, there will be places that people desperately want to save in the face of climate change and other issues of change. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we are preserving this stuff in aspect, that we are leaving it frozen in time and space. Heritage is a constant interaction and revalidation of or challenging of values. So yes, there may be stuff that we want to change because I want to save because this is important. This is stuff, that progressive and that nostalgia that says actually not everything in the past was great, but there are certain things in the past that we want to bring forward into the present and thus into the, help us to imagine new futures. And that, that is part of the heritage process. Yeah.
No, I think you sum it up very well. That heritage is changing, and that so are our and as we bring it from past into the present, for negotiating our futures or claiming our futures, we have to really understand also our own intentions and motivations and the inherent, the underlying power structures that are shaping the heritage discourse at all times. So I think that's really, really very useful for us to, as we go forward in this conference, to remember. And we will come back to this discussion because this will be resonating again and again in our subsequent panels and climate open mic discussions. I see that there's still messages coming up, but I guess we have to move on. There is the next panel, which is the Youth Forum, which has just started, and the link is in the chat for those of you who would like to continue to be with us. Please, you can log into the Youth Forum. And I would like to thank Professor Laurajane Smith for this rich discussion, which doesn't end here. We keep on looking up to her for guiding us through and indeed challenging the authorized discourse, and as it keeps on evolving, because the authorized discourse itself is, for me, I think it's a big takeaway is that this discourse is also evolving, and we need, as we are, we have to reevaluate and re-understand and renegotiate heritage in relation to the crises that we are dealing with. Thank you so much, Professor Laurajane, for your time and to be with us on the eve of Australia Day. We thank you for your attention to everybody, for those of you who have joined us. And
it's my pleasure. Absolutely my pleasure. And I've put into the chat my email if anyone wants to continue the conversation or didn't get to make a point or ask a question they wanted to do, feel free to contact me.
Okay. And we will definitely compile all these questions and also get back to you, and all of those people who have put them in chat will try to get you the answers. Thank you so much.
I would love to see the comments in at my leisure, so that would be great. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.